certainly glad to see everybody here. And of course, those of you that are here live and in person, if you would please turn off your cell phones. That's always good. We need those cell phones off. So this is basically a class about World War II, but before I forget, I need to ask, are there any new OLLI members here, or perhaps there are some on Zoom? If so, welcome to OLLI. I certainly appreciate it, and I think you've made a great choice becoming part of this organization. Certainly, if you have any questions or concerns, certainly I'm sure anybody would be glad to help you with that. And if you have to, you can please feel free to email me as well, and I will be in email communication throughout these sessions. So again, welcome if you're new. Okay. Well, anyway. One thing I'd like to point out to everybody is that if this is part 2 of this class, if you did not see the first parts of this class and you would like to, you can do that by going to YouTube, hitting the search function, which is a box, and type in the Frank Bros Military History channel. When you do that, it'll come up and you'll see my channel, and then directly below it, you will see the first session from last semester. My suggestion is that you do not click on the first session of last semester, because that will take you only to that. So click on my channel, and then you would see all of the available pieces. And then hopefully on a weekly basis, I will update this. So if you should miss a class, you will be able to see that class at that time. So again, Frank Bros Military History channel, and that should be something I will try to keep in communication with everybody as we go forward. So that's kind of where that's at. Now, one thing for those of you that are new to this class, and I know many of you here are not, but some may be, and what I would like to tell you is this, is what is this class about? And when we in the United States look at this war, we tend to look at the war as a U.S. versus Japan confrontation. My goal in this class is to make this significantly larger, and that is simply that we can look at World War II in Asia as a part of World War II. In fact, a huge, huge part of that. So we're going to see the fact that it's not just aimed at the United States and Japan, but aimed at many, many other countries. For example, Russia, Britain, the French are involved. There's so many countries that are involved in World War II in Asia. But particularly, I want to talk about, as particularly the last couple classes, is I will be talking about China. So we don't tend to think about China that much in World War II, I think, as U.S. citizens, but that's going to be a key focus as we go forward, particularly the last 2 classes. So that's something I want to make sure we do. Another thing I want to talk about at the end is how we perceive World War II today and how different countries perceive World War II today. So the United States, we feel great about it. We exported democracy, we defeated the fascists, etc. We use that in certain ways to feel good about ourselves and to promote the United States. Well, other people see this war differently, or will also use it in different manners. For example, most recently, we look at in Russia, they refer to it as the Great Patriotic War. And Mr. Putin has used that to say that Russia should basically regain its previous glory that it got in World War II. And he has used that to say that there are Nazis in Ukraine, and he's going to defeat those Nazis. So we see that's a really great recent example of how different countries perceive World War II. And that's something I'm hopefully going to talk about specifically in the last class about us, not so much, but particularly China, as that narrative has changed significantly. So that's something I really want to do at that point. So that's about a little bit of what this class is going to be about. Well, another thing I like to do in this class is I always kind of like to say what's going on at that particular time that I'm going to be talking about. And today I'm talking about what I call confrontation, the Battle of Guadalcanal. And when we look at what's going on in June of 42? The first piece we have to think about is, how do we get to this point? So the Japanese decided that they would have a confrontation with China, and that started at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937. And that is the beginning of World War II in Asia. And the Japanese have conquered a good portion of China, but they've got themselves into a quagmire, really. And so they're in a situation where they cannot end this war, and they want to end this war desperately. They want to knock China out so they can go about their business doing other probably aggressive things, but still, that's what they want to do. Well, something happens, and that is all of a sudden Germany gets on the scene, and Germany takes over Czechoslovakia, takes over Poland, takes over basically all of Western Europe, has put Russia in a difficult position because they've invaded Russia. They put Britain in a difficult position because Britain's just hanging on. And again, they've defeated the French. So what does that do in Asia is it creates a huge power vacuum. So all these imperialist powers that had control of much of Asia at this time are no longer going to be able to do much with Asia. And the Japanese see this in quotes as the golden opportunity. What they're going to try to do is they're going to capture what they refer to as the Southern Resource Area, which would be the Netherlands East Indies. They are going to try to capture Thailand, Burma, French Indochina, and they're going to try to take all these places that they want to get hegemony in Asia. Their assumption is that Germany will win the war. Their other assumption, though, is that the United States will come to a negotiated settlement with them, that the United States, because particularly of the, I think, the isolationist movement here, that the United States will not be willing to fight for places that they've never even heard of. And so the Japanese think this is it. This is their chance to get all these natural resources that we've never had before. Well, they've expanded significantly by 1942. In fact, they pretty much have conquered everything they wish to conquer. They've got the Southern Resource Area. They've got a defensive perimeter out into the Central Pacific. They feel that now that China is totally isolated and cannot get support from other countries, that China will collapse and they will win that war there as well. So they're looking pretty good at this point. Now, they have had a problem. And that problem is the Battle of Midway. And that took place on June 4th and 5th of 1942. And they have lost 4 of their 6 fleet carriers. That's a big problem for the Japanese Navy. But they still feel pretty good about what's going on. Remember, in Russia, the Germans had a setback in December of 41 in front of Moscow. But then in early spring of 1942, they crushed a Russian offensive that was trying to take Kharkiv. Sounds a little familiar with today, too. But again, the Russians are under pressure because the Germans have launched their summer offensive and they are driving heavily into Russia. They are taking the city of Maikop. They're trying to capture the oil reserves of Russia, which are Maikop and Baku. So at this point in time, they are making a tremendous offensive and gaining tremendous amounts of ground in Russia. So things still look pretty good for the Japanese. The problem they other have is when they have captured this area, the Southern Resource Area, they haven't really got any productive capability. So they've captured a lot of resources, oil, tin, rubber, all these things that are great to have. But they haven't really gotten anything that produces anything. They haven't captured factories. And so what they're now having to do is they're having to take these natural resources and ship them to Japan, turn them into military hardware, and then ship them back out to the front. This is unlike the Germans when they've captured, for example, Czechoslovakia. They captured the Skoda Armaments Works, which was the second largest armaments plant in the world at that time. When they captured France, they get all the productivity of France. They get everything that's productivity in Europe, they can now use to help their war effort. The Japanese have a completely different problem. And the more the Japanese expand, the more problems they have, because they've got a bigger and bigger defensive perimeter to defend. And that is a major, major problem for them. Another key issue with Japan. Japan, again, like I said, has been at war since 1937. They have turned their economy into a total war footing at that time. By 1941, though, the United States economy is still 6 times larger than the Japanese economy. By 1945, and our economy, of course, is not on a war footing. By 1945, we're going to expand our economy by 50%. So we are going to be a gigantic military economy that they cannot compete with. And they understand this. They know they need to get that negotiated settlement. And the last thing they can afford is a war of attrition.
Right, may I interrupt just a moment? Was there any evidence of collusion or cooperation prior to 1937 between the Japanese and the Germans? Was there any connection there, any coordination, or just happenstance?
Okay, so the question, everybody, is was there a connection or a collusion between the Japanese and the Germans, I believe, in 1937? And I would say at that point there was not. There was an effort to have the Germans and the Japanese sign the Comintern Pact, where there would be a liaison between the Germans and them to fight communism. But actually, at that point, the Germans wanted the Chinese to be a part of that pact as well. I don't think there's any huge connection between the Germans and the Chinese, particularly until the tripartite pact of 1940. So I don't think there's any huge, like having a joint chiefs of staff meeting to help those two people. So I hope that answers the question. All right, so in the South Pacific in July of 1942, the Japanese have, again, they want to destroy Australia. They want to isolate Australia. They want to keep Australia or knock Australia possibly out of the war. And what they have done previously is they have landed on New Guinea. And they have tried to capture the city of Port Moresby, which is the most important defensive position on New Guinea. And that was through a seaborne invasion that was turned back at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942. But at the same time they did that, they had taken a small island in the Solomon Islands. That's that red circle. And taking that small island was the island of Tulagi. And Tulagi, what they were going to do there, which they did do, is they set up a seaplane base for reconnaissance. The further effort they wanted to do, particularly the Japanese Navy, was to expand to capture the black circle, which is Samoa and Fiji. And again, you can see those blue lines. The idea of that is the sea route from the United States to support Australia. So they're trying to always expand their air power so they can cut that ability to get goods to Australia and troops. Well, the problem with this is nobody ever wanted to fight in this area. You got to realize that this is a really pretty miserable place. So we talked about this last semester with New Guinea, but the Solomon Islands are the same thing. This is a triple canopy rainforest. It rains 200 inches a year. There's dengue fever. There's malaria, there's scrub typhus. If you don't keep people supplied, if you don't give them proper medical care, if you don't feed them properly, this land will kill you. So it's a very, very ugly place to be fighting a war. But again, because of air power, that's what's going on here. And neither side, the Japanese or the Americans or anybody, is really prepared to fight in this type of climate. It's really just Guadalcanal, which we're talking about, is one of the most malarial places in the world even today. So it's a rough place to be trying to fight a modern battle, but that's what they're going to do because of air power. Well, I think this is a key map here, and gives you an idea of how violent and how big this really was. And we can see the black circle there. That is the town of Rabaul. It's a port. It's on the island of New Britain. That is the main Japanese base in the Solomon Islands area in New Guinea. That's where they have the bulk of their naval and air power. When we look down below, you can see the circle. That is where Guadalcanal is, and Tulagi and Savo Island. There's going to be 15 major sea battles in this little area between August 7th of 1942 and well into 1943. And amazing little area to have 15 sea battles of this magnitude. So you can see how much each side wanted to capture this area and wanted to control it, even though, again, the climate is horrible. So when we think about this, remember this as well. Rabaul is an 1,120-mile round trip to fly a plane from Rabaul to Guadalcanal. So the Japanese air power is extremely stressed in order to support their troops on Guadalcanal. So again, there's only one plane in the world, by the way, that's capable of doing that fighter plane, and that's the Japanese Zero. It has incredible amount of range at this time. Nobody else has a fighter plane that could make an 1,120-mile round trip and fight. So it's one thing to think about that. And plus these pilots are in the air for about 8 hours at a crack. So it's a very stressful battle for the Japanese. But again, 15 major sea battles in this one little area. Well, the United States has plans about this. You know, they're looking at this. And we used at the Battle of Midway a thing called JN-25. And that is the Japanese code that we were able to break that allowed us to win the Battle of Midway. Unfortunately, at this time, like most nations, the Japanese don't realize that we're breaking their codes, but it's just normal for people to change their codes periodically. And right at this particular moment, the Japanese have changed their codes. So we're no longer able to read them as efficiently as we were at Midway just a few months or weeks before. And we still have capabilities to understand how things are going. You have radio direction finding, you have radio traffic capabilities, and we start to see that the Japanese are building up forces at Rabaul. And they automatically interpret that as that the Japanese are going to try to expand again to take perhaps Fiji and Samoa. We don't know that, but that's the supposition. But they know that they want to cut off Australia. Well, they put numerous proposals forth. What should we do about this? And Admiral King, who's head of the Navy, he decides that what they need to do is they need to raid Tulagi. They need to take that base out. Well, MacArthur, who is in Australia in the Army, he decides what they need to do is they need to take out Rabaul. I'm not sure where he thought he had the capability to take out Rabaul, but that's what he wants to do. And they come up with a three-part plan. This will be actually called Operation Cartwheel, which I will talk about in a future class in a little more detail. But just for today's purposes, first thing is they're going to invade Tulagi. The second thing is they're going to move up the coast, up those little islands to get closer to Rabaul, to get air power there. MacArthur is going to move up the northeast coast of New Guinea, again, to get closer to Rabaul. And then finally, the goal is to capture Rabaul. Again, that's a tall order for what they had to work with. And they bring in this guy, and his name is Admiral Gormley. And Gormley is the U.S. liaison to the Royal Navy in Britain. They tell Gormley, we need you out in the South Pacific right away. They fly him to the United States. He's only in the United States for 7 days, and they fly him out to Noumea by New Caledonia, which is, by the way, a Vichy French area. And he decides right away that he needs to meet with MacArthur. And he meets with MacArthur, and they talk about what their capabilities are at this time. And they come up with the conclusion that they don't have the capability even to take Tulagi at this point. And you got to realize that Admiral King is head of the Navy. He's Gormley's boss. Actually, Gormley's boss is Nimitz. So he's 2 steps down from King. And King says, we're going to invade Tulagi and we're going to do it right now. We're not waiting. And it puts these people under a tremendous amount of stress. So why is this going on? Because of the defeat of the Japanese at Midway by losing those 4 carriers. There's going to be also the availability of the brand new 1st Marine Division. The Marines have never fought as a division previous to this, not even in World War I. So that's another piece. So he's got a force. He's got his own naval troops. He doesn't have to rely on the Army. And he says, you know what? We need to do this. And he's going to take a huge gamble. He's going to strike the Japanese before they can get reorganized. Well, when we look at the Japanese fleet and the U.S. fleet at this time, the most important single thing in World War II, of course, is aircraft carriers. I'm sure pretty much everybody's aware of that. The Japanese have 2 fleet carriers, the Shokaku and Zuikaku. Those are 2 of the best, probably the best carriers in the world at this time. We don't have a comparable carrier until the Essex class in 1943. They also have auxiliary carriers made out of ocean liners, and they have a bunch of light carriers. They also have a strong naval air arm that's land-based. The U.S. has 4 carriers. We've got the Enterprise, the Hornet, the Saratoga, and the Wasp. We also have a significant amount of air power at Port Moresby in New Guinea and in Australia. That's under control of MacArthur. So I look at it at this particular point in World War II that the fleets are even. They're basically have a similar amount of strength. Well, Admiral King says, you know, we're going to do this, and he throws together this organization as quickly as he can, and he demands that this invasion start on August 1st of 1942. Gormley, again, he's not in charge, really. He's a subordinate, and he reluctantly agrees, but with one caveat. MacArthur must use air power from Port Moresby and New Guinea to knock out Rabaul. And MacArthur agrees to this. Unfortunately, MacArthur cannot do this. He does not have the capability to knock out Rabaul. But he says he can do it. That puts him over the top, and now this thing is going to go forward. There's commanders on the scene. And the commanders on the scene are Vandergrift, who's the head of the 1st Marine Division, again, brand new division. And there's going to be Admiral Fletcher, who's in charge of our carriers. And they're like, this is going to be a problem. But, you know, we're part of the Navy, and King's demanding this, and we're going to have to do it. And they know from the start that they got a problem, because the United States has always been Europe first, Germany first. So they know there's going to be an invasion of North Africa in November of 1942. And almost the bulk of our resources, particularly naval and aviation resources, are going to take care for that invasion in North Africa. So they know that once they start this thing, they're not going to get a lot of troops. They're not going to get Army troops, or just to speak of. They're not going to be able to get a lot of extra aircraft. They're not going to get a lot of Navy support. So they refer to this thing, particularly the Marines refer to this as Operation Shoestring, because it's thrown together and it's got very, very minimal amount of force for the task at hand. Well, so when we look at this is going to be critical, actually, not just through World War II, but actually even post-war, this debate will continue. And I just want to put this out. We will see this again in other classes, but the U.S. forces in the Pacific area are not unified. So there's various commands. Okay, so if we look at the lower right of this picture, you can see the South Pacific area. That's where Gormley is. He reports to Nimitz. Nimitz basically controls the Central Pacific and the Northern Pacific area. To the left, where Australia is, that is MacArthur. That is the Army, the U.S. Army's area of control. And then if you go all the way to the left, Southeast Asia Command, that is where the British have control. So when we look at this, you can see that there's no central command here for the entire Pacific War. And again, this will go on. It'll cause problems in the Philippines. It'll cause problems at Okinawa. It'll cause problems at Iwo Jima. The fact that there's not one unified command. And MacArthur desperately wants to have the unified command. I want to be in charge of the Pacific. And Admiral King in the Navy said, there's no way. We are not giving you our ships. So this is going to be a feud. Now, where's this feud kind of come from? It goes back many, many years. And I think primarily because of trying to get appropriations, to get money. Even in peacetime, the Navy and the Army are always fighting over who gets more cash to do their job. And so there's always been this friction between the Navy and the Army in this regard. And of course, then the Army Air Force will come in later on as a third party in this whole event. So it's really... It's amazing that it worked as well as it did, as divided as command is. But notice the line there for MacArthur and Gormley, and I've got a red circle there for where the Guadalcanal and Tulagi are, and that line actually fell into MacArthur's area originally. They actually had to move the line so that Gormley needs to have control over this because of King's demands on this. So realistically, this it's going to cause problems. Let's leave it at that. So, all right. Well, the Japanese have plans too, of course. They wanted the Navy wanted to take Samoa and Fiji, and right after, I think the 11th of June. Yeah, the 11th of June. They wanted to postpone that invasion because of their losses at Midway. And then quietly, they decide that, we'll just kind of cancel the whole thing for right now. We'll get to it later. And the reason that is that if you think that the United States Navy and the United States Army are dysfunctional, the Japanese make us look like a kumbaya sing-along. I mean, realistically, the Japanese Army and the Navy do not get along at all. Okay. And they compete with each other, and they cause their own problems, much worse even than ours. Well, so that's canceled by the Navy. Well, the Army says, well, you Navy guys failed us. We couldn't have that invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea. So what we're going to do is we're going to make an overland attack for Port Moresby, which we talked about in a previous class. We're going to go over the Owen Stanley Mountains, and we're going to invade and going to take over Port Moresby, and New Guinea will be ours. So again, you have this friction between the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy at this point. Well, they're also going to do another thing, and they're going to build a small fleet. And this small fleet will be based at Rabaul. It'll be under this gentleman, Admiral Makawa. And it's a 8th Fleet. It's the Outer South Seas Force. It consists of 7 elderly heavy cruisers, 2 flotillas of destroyers, and 5 submarines. So is this a big force? Absolutely not. But he does have one huge advantage. He has the 11th Air Fleet, the Naval Air Fleet. And these are some of the greatest pilots and one of the best units in the Japanese Navy. Land-based, but this is Japanese Navy. We don't do a similar thing really, but this is how they've structured their fleet. And I've talked a little bit about these people before, but just as a reminder, the 4 of the top aces in Japan come from this unit. We have Ota, we have Lieutenant Sasai, we have Nishizawa, who is probably the greatest Japanese ace in World War II. And we have the most famous ace from Japanese World War II is Saburo Sakai. He survives the war and writes books. That's why he's so well known. When you look at these 4 guys, depending on who you want to read, but I will just throw out a number that I think is probably accurate. These 4 people shot down 200 Allied aircraft. So they've got the 11th Air Fleet has some great pilots, and it's Macau's biggest asset. Well, again, King wants to launch this attack on August 1st. And then there's a problem, because what happens is they find out that the Japanese are building an air base on Guadalcanal. Now you got to realize Tulagi is 22 miles away from Guadalcanal, from that air base to the island of Tulagi. It's a really small area. And they're like, oh, hey, well, we got to change the plan, because we can't just invade Tulagi and some other islands. We need now to invade Guadalcanal, because we got to capture that airfield before the Japanese have it built. And so now they changed their entire plan again, and they're going to have a meeting. And there's going to be 3 people at that meeting. There should have been 4. And Gormley says, okay, we're going to have a meeting, but you know what? I just got here. I'm too busy. I can't attend. Now he's in charge of these guys, right? And I don't have time. But you 3 guys, you go hash it out. Well, here's what the deal is. Fletcher is in charge of the aircraft carriers. And he's basically going to be in overall command of this part of the invasion. And he tells Turner, who is in charge of the Admiral Turner, who's in charge of the landing force and the cargo ships and the cruiser defense force, and Vandergrift, who I said is in charge of the 1st Marine Division. Fletcher tells him, you know, I can only hang around here for 3 days. And after 3 days, I need to withdraw my carriers. And the reason for that is simply this, is to put carriers stationary by a land target puts them at risk. They're at risk because the advantage of aircraft carriers is they can move so much. Well, by stationing them off this island to provide combat air patrols over Guadalcanal and support these troops, they become stationary. Now they're subject to attack from Japanese land-based air power, and they're subject to attack from submarines because they're fixed. And he knows that. They know the capabilities of aircraft carriers is you need to be able to move them around. Well, that's a problem. And also he's been told by Nimitz, his boss, don't lose an aircraft carrier unless you can cause more damage to the enemy than we received. So in other words, you need to focus on destroying enemy aircraft carriers. And so Fletcher goes, 3 days, guys, out of here. Turner and Vandergrift go crazy. Depending again who you want to read, they almost come to blows over this. They're so angry about it because they need 5 days to unload those transports. And he's only going to give them 3. And so you see right from the beginning here that there's huge problems with this invasion. The 3 people in charge of the invasion can't get along. And mostly Gormley, who should have gone, doesn't show up. He's the one that should have told him this is how it's going to go down. So he should have reduced that friction. He should have taken responsibility for making these command decisions. And he does not do that. Well, I like this picture because this is actually a picture taken by U.S. reconnaissance of the airfield before we land on Guadalcanal. So we can see here that airfield's pretty close to being built. And so that just puts more pressure on us trying to capture this airfield. Well, again, the original invasion, which is called Operation Watchtower, not Operation Shoestring, that was to capture Tulagi and Santa Cruz. Well, now they have to capture Guadalcanal. And they've not even got 2 months to put this thing together, which is incredibly fast. And a problem comes is with throwing this thing together so quickly is there are supply ships that are coming from the United States. And these supply ships are not what they call combat loaded. What means combat loaded means is when you have an invasion, there's stuff on the ship that you need right away is at the top, so you can get it out right away. These ships aren't combat loaded. So what happens then is they get to Australia. They need to take everything off these ships and put it all back on in the way that they need it to be. The Australian dock workers are not cooperative. And so the 1st Marine Division basically has to do this themselves. Then, at this point, Turner's under the impression that, I need more time. And he tells King, he goes, I can't get this done on August 1st. And King says, fine, you got till August 7th. Gives them not a lot of time. And that's how that goes down. And so now 75 ships, these are not all warships. Some of them, of course, are cargo ships and troop transports. They meet near Fiji and they have a practice landing. It's a disaster. It goes terrible. And they're like, oh, man, hey, this is, we got problems here, gang, but they're going to go on anyway. And they get one gigantic advantage. The weather is terrible. So on their way to Guadalcanal and Tulagi, remember, Tulagi is a reconnaissance base for seaplanes. Well, the weather's crummy. And what happens? They don't spot them at all. Japanese wake up on the morning of August 7th with an entire U.S. fleet right off their coast, shelling them, and Fletcher's carriers destroy all their float planes. A tremendous advantage. And the Japanese are like, oh, how did this happen? And you can see on the picture, you can see Task Group Yoke. That will be the invasion of Tulagi. That'll be 3,000 men. And then there's Task Group X-Ray. That will be the invasion of Guadalcanal. That will be 11,000 men. So the fighting on Tulagi is very, very, very tough. It goes on for 3 days. That's where the Japanese have the biggest concentration of combat-capable people. And they finally managed to capture Tulagi, and then some of the Japanese actually escape onto Florida Island, which is the bigger island there, and they are not finally destroyed until about 2 months later. Well, on Guadalcanal, they get land unopposed. There's nobody on Guadalcanal except construction troops. And the construction troops, they're not going to fight. They're like, hey, out of here. So they run away. And they abandon all their food. They abandon all their equipment. The Marines, oh, by the way, they abandoned a bunch of beer and sake too, which the Marines enjoyed significantly. But the fact is the Marines are going to come to welcome this generosity significantly, as we'll see as we go along here today. This was a tremendous mistake by the Japanese to leave that stuff available for the Marine Corps. Well, let's just talk about this map just for a second, because I think this is the best map I have here to clarify the area. Rabaul is up at the top there of the top of the line, and you can see as you go diagonally towards the right corner, there's the island of Bougainville, and then what's known as the slot. The slot is the space between the islands. And then at the very bottom, you'll see Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Tulagi in Florida. Keep in mind, like I said, this is a 1,120-mile round trip. So the Japanese aircraft have to fly in a straight line, the zeros. They don't have the range. And because they have to fly in a straight line, they have to fly over the island of Bougainville. We have, actually the Australians have, people that are called coast watchers. And the coast watchers have radios. So when the Japanese fly over, they radio to Guadalcanal and say, there's a flight of Japanese planes headed your way. That gives us time to get our planes off the ground and in position to attack the Japanese. A huge advantage once the airfield becomes available. And that's something that we need to worry about. Well, the Japanese begin to launch airstrikes from that 11th Air Fleet. And the Japanese are not, the bombers have a tough time, to be honest with you. They're getting shot down by our air combat air patrol. They're getting annihilated by our anti-aircraft defenses. And in 2 days of intensive attacks, they managed to sink one transport and put a torpedo into the destroyer Jarvis, which will be sunk later on in the battle a couple of days later. But what they managed to do is they managed to stop these transports from unloading. You can't unload the transport when you're under air attack, so you need to start moving around and getting out of Dodge so you don't get hit. Well, that slows down that ability to unload. Remember, they needed 5 days. Well, now they need even more time. And another thing happens is those Japanese fighter pilots shoot down 14 of Fletcher's Wildcat fighters. Fletcher needs the Wildcats in order to maintain combat air patrol over his carriers and to maintain combat air patrol over Guadalcanal. And Fletcher says, well, I've lost so many fighters, I can't do both anymore, and now I need to withdraw. So instead of withdrawing in 3 days, he now wants to withdraw in 2 days. Well, the Japanese do another thing. They're going to send everything they have in naval power, that's Mikawa's fleet, and he throws together everything he has, which is 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. That's not a balanced fleet, but again, the Japanese are doing everything they can. And he's going to rush this fleet down to try to capture or destroy the invasion at Guadalcanal. And his plan is to get there on the night of the 8th. Remember, they landed on the morning of the 7th. And his goal is because he's afraid of U.S. air power, he's going to rush in, launch this attack, and then he's going to try to scoot back up the slot before he can be caught by U.S. planes that he believes, and he's correct, are south of Guadalcanal on the aircraft carriers. Our planes don't have a lot of range. And that's his goal right there. Now, what happens? Mikawa's force is spotted by MacArthur's troops. Look at the line there. That's the dividing line, and you can see how close that is between Gormley's responsibility and MacArthur's responsibility. So MacArthur is responsible for reconnaissance in the vast majority of this picture. Well, MacArthur's Air Force flyers find the Japanese. Unfortunately, there's a problem. They don't really know what they're looking at. And I tell you what, even naval pilots have a problem identifying ships at sea, particularly this time. Well, his people see this group of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, and they report back that what they've seen is 2 seaplane tenders and 2 gunboats. Well, now I'm the U.S. force and the Australian force down at Guadalcanal, and I'm like going, well, I'm not too worried about that. Yeah, 2 seaplane tenders, 2 gunboats. What are they going to do? They're going to probably set up a seaplane base at the end of Bougainville so they're closer to us. So we're not worried. Nothing to worry about there. And once again, MacArthur is not able to suppress Japanese air power on Rabaul. He doesn't live up to his part of the bargain, to be honest with you. And it's a sad state of events, really, that his people have misidentified this force so badly. Well, yes.
Where were they when they were misidentified?
Right off Bougainville.
South?
No. About even with it, really.
Okay.
They were actually identified twice.
Misidentified.
So anyway, by the evening of August 8th, Fletcher has told Turner and Vandergrift he's getting out of Dodge that night. He doesn't have the capability to stay there any longer. And of course, the transports aren't even nearly done unloading because they've been under all this pressure and they haven't had enough time. And Vandergrift and Turner's actually driving this boat at this time, says, I need to have a meeting with all of you guys. And that includes Admiral Crutchley. Admiral Crutchley is a Royal Naval officer that's serving as commander of this Australian force. He's been loaned to Australia. He's the cruiser commander. He's in charge of defending the anchorage from the Japanese surface forces. And he makes a pretty bad decision, really. And Crutchley decides to take his cruiser Australia out of line and sail to Tulagi to have this meeting. Now, what he could have done is he could have taken the cruiser there, gotten out of a small boat, had the meeting, and sent the cruiser back. Makes another key mistake, though, is he puts Captain Bodie of the USS Chicago, which is a heavy cruiser, in charge of this force. Bad idea. So this is how the Allies have defended this area from the slot. Remember, the Japanese are coming down towards them from down the slot. They've, in the red circle, you can see the Ralph Talbot. That is the destroyer on picket duty. The lower circle, the blue circle, is the destroyer Blue. Amazing, it shows that color for its circle. And you could see that they are going to be guarding the two entrances into this area, the north entrance, north of Savo Island, and the south entrance. You can also see the U.S. Southern Force, which now consists of the cruiser Chicago, the Australian cruiser Canberra, and 2 destroyers. The Northern Force consists of 3 U.S. cruisers, the Astoria, Quincy, and the Vincennes, and 2 more destroyers. So when we look at these forces, you really have 6 U.S. destroyers and 5 U.S. cruisers facing 7 Japanese cruisers and 1 destroyer. So it's not an outrageously huge advantage for the Japanese by any means. Unfortunately, there's going to be more problems. And the Allied forces are pretty exhausted. They've been at combat readiness, totally combat level for 2 days, for 48 hours. They're beat. And the decision is made to, there's no reason to worry. There's no Japanese around. They reduce them to combat level 2. So their readiness level has dropped. Because there's no reason to worry about it because there's no Japanese around. Well, Mikawa is coming in, and what he does is he launches float planes, which is typical Japanese doctrine, even at night. And float planes are to scout, and they're to perhaps drop flares to backlight the U.S. forces when they're found, and the other the Japanese are there. Well, the Japanese spot the Ralph Talbot. And they're like, ooh, we better kind of change course here and kind of get away from it. Then they spot the Blue. And at that point, Mikawa slows his ships down because he doesn't want to leave a wake and make them easier to see. And what he's able to do is he's trying to get past those 2 U.S. destroyers that have radar and have lookouts. Now, he's seen both of them. They don't see either one. Somehow, I have no answer to how this occurs, but the Japanese are slipped past without being detected or notified by radar. They are not spotted by either U.S. destroyer. And they are now going to slip in through the southern area past the Blue with no notification, and they are going to fall upon the southern cruisers. And the Chicago is hit by a torpedo. The Canberra is shelled to a wreck in just minutes. And Bodie sends absolutely no warning out to anybody. And in fact, takes the Chicago out of the fight and tries to sail away. I would personally think that's dereliction of duty, but that would be my opinion. But he has now exposed the northern force to the full force of Mikawa's organization. And what we're going to see now is they have seen flashes in the horizon. They're like, well, there's a thunderstorm around. Maybe that's just lightning bolts. They receive a notification from the destroyer Patterson from the Southern Force that there's unknown ships. But they don't really say we're under attack. They just send out a message that there's unknown ships. They don't react quickly to this. And then Mikawa is going to fall on them. And then quickly, the Astoria, Vincennes, and Quincy are all torpedoed by those famous Japanese long lance torpedoes, which we've talked about. Those of you, if you're new to the class, the Japanese have the best torpedoes in the world. And the U.S. forces actually believe that they're firing on friendly ships and are ordered to stop firing. Well, of course, all three ships are going to be quickly destroyed. Well, Mikawa has two options now. He's destroyed the defensive forces, and he could fall on those transports. There's still some other capabilities the U.S. has. The Australia is there, the cruiser San Juan is there, etc. But he has an opportunity to try and destroy those transports. But remember, his original plan was to do damage and then escape back up the slot before U.S. air power can catch him. He doesn't know that Fletcher has taken the carriers away. So you've got a major problem for the Japanese, but he follows his original plan. So an opportunity at this point to basically have destroyed our capability to reinforce the Marines on these islands is lost. So this is probably the first big time the Japanese have a chance to influence this battle, and they don't manage to do that. Well, the next morning, Turner decides that I got to pull the transports out of here. I don't have any defensive capability anymore. And Vandegrift says, please don't do this. I have to have more supplies. And he agrees, Turner agrees to at least stay for the rest of the day and continue to unload. And that's what they do. At the same time, Turner says, if there's any ships that can't withdraw, we have to destroy them. So at this point, the Canberra, which has been basically as a floating wreck, is not decide to tow it away. They decide just to sink it with torpedoes. So the Canberra is lost. Well, Mikawa has inflicted the greatest defeat on the U.S. Navy in history. I know you could think about Pearl Harbor, but remember, Pearl Harbor, we're not at war. These were ships that should have been prepared, should have been able to fight back, and they basically don't. But he's also achieved another thing, is he's managed to chase away all the supplies for the 1st Marine Division. So they are in a tough situation now because they don't have the supplies they need to feed themselves and to build that airfield, except thanks to the Japanese, they do. Well, now Vandegrift and the Marines are left to their own basically devices. The United States Navy will come in and try to resupply them during the daytime, but for a few days, the Marines are completely on their own. So let's talk about those Marines. So when we look at the 1st Marine Division, it's a newly organized unit. The Marines, again, have never fought as a division previous to this, not even in World War I. So they've got a lot of new volunteer recruits that basically joined up after Pearl Harbor. They're not really well trained at this point. They're armed with old 1903 Springfield rifles and old World War I tin helmets, because the Marines always get the cast-offs of other things that the Army and the Navy don't want. But they do have an advantage, and I'll read this to you quickly. That they have a bunch of people that were there, that probably the only combat veterans in the United States Army, except for people that had served in World War I. And these were the professionals, the old breed. Many had fought Caicos in Haiti, Bandidos in Nicaragua, French, English, Italian, American soldiers and sailors in every bar in Shanghai. They were inveterate gamblers and accomplished scroungers who drank hair tonic in preference to PX beer, which they referred to as horse piss. Many dipped snuff, smoked rank cigars, and chewed tobacco. Cigarettes for women and children. So these were experts in basically every type of infantry weapon we had. And they knew they were good, and there were enough of them to leaven the division to impart thousands of younger men a share of both the unique spirit which animated them and the skills they possessed. So this group will turn the 1st Marine Division, the old breed, we'll all eventually get that title, but really the old breed is these people. that had been China Marines, etc. So it is a huge advantage that we will have that these people were available. Well, the Japanese, they're not standing still here. They want Guadalcanal back. And what they want to do is they're going to land a group, and they only think there's about 2,000 Marines on the island. Well, there's actually 11,000 Marines on the island, but the Japanese, there's probably 2,000, no big deal. And the Japanese are going to land 20 miles away from Lunga Point, primarily where the airfield is. It's going to be to the right of the picture. It's actually off this picture. This is going to be known as the Battle of the Tenaru, which is completely misnamed because it doesn't take place at the Tenaru River. It takes place at a place called Alligator Creek. But regardless, historically, so if you look at the map, you see that red area, that's where the Japanese assault is going to take place. And they send in the unit, the Ichiki detachment. They don't send the entire thing in. They can only land so much. They don't have capability to bring ships in. They just rush these guys in. And that's about 917 men. And Ichiki's unit was the unit that was going to take Midway Island. So they're available in the area. Well, they don't have any heavy weapons. There's only 917 of them. They don't have much equipment. But Ichiki says, there's only 2,000 Marines. We could take those guys. And he orders a frontal attack on Alligator Creek with 800 men. Well, of course, they are immediately repulsed and destroyed. They're trying to cross a sandbar. If you've seen the show, The Pacific, this is graphically portrayed on that in that television series. And it's a disaster. I mean, really, it's a pretty much a joke. And the next morning, what the Marines do is they come in around the Japanese. They isolate them in that red pocket. They send in a couple of light tanks, and they basically just destroy the Japanese unit completely. 777 Japanese are killed out of approximately 800. Well, something we need to remember, those of you that were here for the second class, I've talked about Ichiki before. Ichiki was actually at the Marco Polo Bridge in command of the little unit that starts firing that actually leads to the start of World War II in Asia. So I think it's very interesting that Ichiki would be in such a prominent location twice in World War II. Indeed, he's at the first attack by the Japanese at Guadalcanal, and he's also one of the people that helped start World War II in Asia at the Marco Polo Bridge, which is I think it's pretty strange, but again, that's just kind of the way things work out. We will talk about his direct commander named Mutaguchi in a later presentation, because Mutaguchi is probably the one that really causes World War II to start in Asia. So, well, that's a picture of the results of the Japanese on the sandbar. And so the Japanese, because they won't surrender, because of another incident that's taken place a few days earlier called the Getgi Patrol, the Japanese surround a U.S. Marine patrol and slaughter them. They don't take any prisoners. There's 3 guys out of 25 that escape and report this. This becomes national news in the United States, and actually there's a movie scene in the movie Guadalcanal Diary made in 1943 about this event. So it becomes a huge part of how the war gets more and more violent. So the Japanese won't surrender, and the Japanese won't take prisoners. The Marines are going to react to that, and not in a particularly positive manner. And Vandegrift says this. He goes, "I've never heard or read of this kind of fighting. These people refuse to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade." So even Japanese wounded, and we've talked about this again in New Guinea, won't surrender. So it's part of what I refer to, and many historians talk about, as the Japanese cult of death. And we'll see that throughout the war in the Pacific between basically everybody. Well, The key to victory is going to be this airfield. If you can hold this airfield, you will control the daylight time around the island of Guadalcanal, and the Japanese will not be able to land supplies and troops. So holding this airfield is going to be the most important single thing they can do. They get it built thanks to the Japanese leaving them a little bulldozer and a train. They get it done by August 18th. And if you look carefully at this picture, you can see little round dots. That's Japanese bomb craters. And the red circle, you can see 7 probably Marine Corps aircraft on that island, on that airstrip. So indeed, this is the key to the battle. Again, you hold this airfield, you control daylight and the ability to land troops or particularly supplies on the island. Well, the field is named after Lofton Henderson, who was killed at Midway. He's a Marine pilot. His squadron has 1 plane remaining in the world. The only plane left is at the Pensacola Museum, which I've talked about. You can see this plane, you can touch it. And that little Douglas Dauntless was part of Lofton Henderson's squadron. So Henderson Field is quite a famous piece for the Marine Corps as well as the United States. Well, the Japanese are now confronted with land-based fighters and Dauntless dive bombers. The Dauntless dive bombers are particularly effective in this particular area. And again, it's just such a long flight from Rabaul that they really have a trouble getting any planes towards this area. So this is a huge, huge problem for the Japanese that now we have an airfield. Well, it's going to lead to the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. And the Japanese have decided they need to capture this island. And on August 24th, they're going to do that. They're going to send 3 carriers to escort a bunch of slow cargo ships. And that will be the Shokaku, the Zuikaku, which I've talked about best in the world, and the light carrier Ryujo. They have 177 planes. They're going to be confronted by the Saratoga and the Enterprise. The Wasp has been transferred to get fuel. Again, fuel is always a problem. It's always difficult in this location to have enough oilers around to be constantly refueling your ships. So they find the Ryujo. The Ryujo has sent a attack on the airfield, and it's destroyed. The Japanese counter with 2 strikes, and they managed to score 3 bomb hits on the Enterprise, damage it severely, and you can see the results of the explosion there on the Enterprise. And they cause severe damage, and the Enterprise is slowed. What happens is the Japanese second strike is misinformed as to where the U.S. carriers are. And because they're misinformed, they don't find them. So the Enterprise most likely gets away with just basically 3 bomb hits and survives. What they do, though, is they launch their aircraft and they have them land on Henderson Field. So even though the Enterprise is out of the battle, its air group, much of it, is indeed now at Henderson Field to help support the Marines. And they've managed to attack the Japanese transports. They sink a bunch of them and force the rest back. So the Japanese are not able to resupply Guadalcanal. Well, the Japanese have a problem because of the airfield, and they need to find a way to get more troops and supplies onto Guadalcanal. And what they're going to do is they're going to use the thing we call the Tokyo Express. They're going to send destroyers shooting down the slot. They're going to, when it gets to be nighttime, they're going to rush in as fast as they can. They're going to unload as fast as they can, and then they're going to get up the slot and try to get out of range of U.S. aircraft, because remember, U.S. aircraft don't have a lot of range. Well, it's not a particularly good plan, okay, because indeed you can drop soldiers off. They can jump off the ship and get off and get onto land. Unfortunately, you can't land tanks and artillery and food and things you need at this method. So the Japanese come up with a name for this. They refer to this as rat transport, which because rats come out at night. But we call it Tokyo Express, very famous. So what they end up doing, because this is the only way they can supply in the face of Henderson Field, is they actually start taking oil drums, filling them up with supplies, tying them together and dumping them off the destroyers, hoping that they'll be recovered by the troops on shore. This is a terrible, terrible way to supply people. Well, the Japanese managed to get 5,000 troops ashore. Again, they vastly underestimate the amount of U.S. forces. And what they're going to do is they're going to make an attack, not a direct attack, but attack through the rainforest. And you can see that in this picture. The horizontal line is their line of advance, and then the vertical line will be their line of attack to capture the airfield. Vandegrift has put the vast majority of his forces along the beach because he expects the Japanese to do a typical counter landing, a beach landing. But he realizes that the area in front of the rainforest is not particularly well defended. And he calls in a unit that's on Tulagi, a raider battalion, under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. And he tells them, you got to come from Tulagi. I need you to reinforce this perimeter. He puts them up on this ridge. And this will be one of the most famous battles in Marine Corps history. And so on the night of the 12th to the 14th, 3,000 Japanese attack Edson's little 900 force. And finally, Edson gets some reinforcements, gets some artillery support, but the Japanese nearly break through to Fighter 1, which is the lower of the two airfields. We built another little airfield. So they managed to, the Japanese kill 104 of Edson's men, but they kill approximately 800 Japanese. And for that amazing stand, Edson is going to receive the Medal of Honor. And it's going to cause the Japanese another problem, though, because now they realize that they can't seem to take this airfield. They can't take Guadalcanal. And what they're going to do is they're going to suspend the operation in New Guinea. So that attempt to go over the Owen Stanley Mountains to capture Port Moresby, remember, they're only 20 miles away when they pull a plug on this. They are now going to focus all their efforts on destroying the Marines on Guadalcanal. So you realize the Japanese have a problem as far as their total capabilities. They've got 600,000 men in China fighting. They have several divisions in Burma fighting the British. They have men in Java, Malaysia. They can't do all this stuff. So now they have to make a decision to pull the plug on trying to capture New Guinea at this time. They don't give up on capturing New Guinea, believe me. But indeed, they have to focus now on trying to capture Guadalcanal. And they're going to do something different now. They don't have the air power, so they're going to send in a couple of battleships. And the battleships are going to shell the airfield to destruction. And while that is going on, they're going to try to rush some more transports in. And that's going to take place on October 14th. The Congo and the Haruna are going to attack that airfield. And what they're going to do is they're going to use their 14-inch naval cannons to try to destroy it. And the Japanese have created a weapon that's probably, I think, one of the strangest in World War II, is they've taken a 14-inch shell that weighs approximately 2,000 pounds and turned it into an anti-aircraft shell. So the idea of this thing is you fire it, it's got a timed fuse, you try to predict the time where it will be by the aircraft, then it blows up and fires incendiaries, hopefully to shoot down aircraft. Well, these guns only fire 2 times a minute. That's not a particularly effective anti-aircraft weapon. But if you're attacking a soft target like an airfield, it's not such a bad weapon because you can set it so at times to blow up over the airfield and scatter incendiaries all over. Well, they fire 104 of those in a total of 973 14-inch shells, and they do terrific damage. And the Marines that were there always talk about this, about how horrible this bombardment was. And it makes me think about when we've surrounded Japanese islands later in the war with battleships, and we shell them with thousands of shells. How much the Japanese must have felt about that. So indeed, it's amazing how much this is prevalent in histories about this battle by people that were there. And well, they managed to destroy most of the airfield. They blow up most of the fuel. By the morning, there's only 7 of those Dauntless dive bombers that are still flyable. None of the torpedo bombers are flyable. And they managed to clean the airfield up by midday and launch those few planes they have. And they start to attack those Japanese transports again. And again, the Japanese turn around. They cannot face this air assault from this airfield. Well, by this time, things are not going particularly well at Guadalcanal, let's be honest about it. And it's beginning to be seen that Gormley is a problem. And Gormley is constantly sending pessimistic messages to Nimitz. And he's living on a ship in the harbor at Noumea because the Vichy French won't allow him to have a residence on land. He's in this little hot office. He never leaves the office. He's there constantly. He never visits the troops. He never goes to ships and talks to the Navy. He doesn't do anything to build morale in this unit. And finally, basically, Nimitz is fed up. And he said, all right, I got to make a change. And he calls in Admiral Halsey. And Halsey's, I would say, is probably the most aggressive commander we have in World War II in the Navy. I would say oftentimes too aggressive. But quite honestly, so Halsey calls in Vandegrift and he says, look, can you hold? And Vandegrift says, yeah, I can hold, but I need more support than I'm getting. And he tells him, you go back there, Vandegrift. I promise to give you everything I've got. You know what? And Halsey does do that. He goes to Guadalcanal. He goes and meets with the ships. He talks to everybody. He builds fighting spirit, critical at this time. And basically, he's going to keep that promise to Vandegrift. And he puts up this famous sign on Tulagi. And Admiral Halsey says, kill Japs, kill more Japs. You will help kill the yellow bastards if you do your job well. And he builds morale. I can't give him enough credit for this portion of the war, how much this changes what's going on at Guadalcanal, because quite honestly, the Japanese are doing everything they can now to take this island, and now they're going to have another offensive. And this is on October 15th. And what they're going to do, it's going to be a similar plan. They've now landed 20,000 troops on this island. And they've got to manage to get a few tanks on and a few pieces of artillery, not a lot of ammunition. But they've done everything they can. And they think there's about 10,000 Marines on the island. But we've been reinforcing the island too. In fact, now there are actually Army troops on the island as well. And there are now 23,000 Marines and Army troops defending Guadalcanal. So the Japanese plan is simple. They're going, if you look at the left side of this map, they're going to launch an attack there, trying to draw our forces in that direction. And then once again, they're going to send a major force through the rainforest to try to capture the airfields. Well, it's really difficult. You have to realize how difficult it is to organize troops in the middle of a tropical rainforest. So when the Japanese actually launch the assault onto the towards the airfield, they don't even really know where they are. One unit gets completely lost. One unit thinks it's right in front of the Marines. They're actually over a mile away, so they launch an attack basically into nothing. And it's completely uncoordinated. It's a mess. Well, there's 3 days of heavy fighting, and that's 6,000 men that have tried to take the airfield. By the time they withdraw and get back to the main Japanese line, there's only 700 effectives. So it's another disaster for the Japanese. But while this is going on, there's going to be the Battle of Santa Cruz. And I would say, without question, this is the last time Japanese naval air power is effective against the United States Navy. They send a pretty strong fleet. They're going to send the Shokaku Zuikaku, those two converted ocean liners and a light carrier. And they're going to fight against the Enterprise and the Hornet. Now, why does the U.S. only have two carriers?
Wasp got sunk by torpedo.
Exactly. They have been sunk by, the Wasp has been sunk by a Japanese submarine, and the Saratoga has been hit by a Japanese submarine as well and is forced to withdraw. But before the Saratoga leaves, what does it do? It sends its planes to Henderson Field. Well, this is what they're going to do. They're going to try to destroy us, and they're going to do the best they can. And the Imperial Japanese Navy carriers have a difficult time with the fact that they're low on fuel, but this is a tremendous attack on the last of their great pilots, really, that are carrier-based. And they managed to hit the Hornet with 5 bombs, 3 torpedoes. 2 of the Japanese planes are badly damaged and crash into the Hornet, and they hit the Enterprise with 3 bombs. But we managed to damage the Shokaku and the Zuyo. But the biggest problem is they've lost 97 of 199 planes. We've killed 148 irreplaceable air crew. They have the 102 aircraft they have left, only 86 are flyable. And at this point, the Japanese fleet withdraws. They're low on fuel. They're out of planes. They're out of pilots. And they will never fight in the Solomons again. There will only be another carrier battle in World War II of this kind of magnitude in 1944. So Japanese and U.S. carriers will not meet again until spring of 1944. When we look at this picture, you can see the lower circle is a Japanese torpedo bomber. The upper circle is a Japanese Val dive bomber. That Val dive bomber will score a hit. It's badly damaged, and then the pilot crashes into the Hornet. Now remember the amount of damage I said that the Hornet has taken. This ship doesn't sink right away. It's abandoned. It's a floating hulk. And the next day, Japanese destroyers come upon it, and they end up torpedoing it. That's how much damage this type of U.S. carrier could take at this time. It's pretty amazing to me how sturdy the Yorktown class really was. Well, this is going to lead to the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The Japanese, again, are doing everything they can to take this island. They're going to try to bring in 11 transports and 7,000 more troops with large amounts of food and ammunition. And they're going to try to bombard Henderson Field again and destroy Henderson Field. Halsey sends in everything he has at this time, which is a cruiser force under Admiral Callahan. And what they do is basically the way to look at this. You see the Japanese units are strung out and the U.S. forces in one strong line. But due to basically communication failures and radar problems, the United States force blunders directly into this tremendously more powerful, with 2 battleships, Japanese force. And this causes what's been described as a ballroom brawl with the lights out. These ships are now going to fight at literally point blank range. U.S. destroyers get so close to the, particularly the Japanese battleship Hiei, that they are able to use machine guns to fire at a battleship. The battleship main armament cannot be suppressed low enough to even fire at the destroyers because they're that close. It's an incredible, confusing. I would suggest that if you're interested, please read about it because it's an amazing battle. But Callahan and Admiral Scott are both killed in the battle. The Japanese have the opportunity once again to get in and shell Henderson Field with the battleship. One of their 2 that's not damaged. The Hiei is heavily damaged. And Abe, the commander, decides to withdraw. And he leaves that airfield intact once again. The next morning, the aircraft take off and they manage to catch the damaged Hiei, and our dauntless dive bombers sink it. So the Hiei is lost. So the Japanese actually lose a battleship in this engagement. But again, they're doing everything they can to destroy this airfield. Well, now the night of the 13th, the very next night, they send in a cruiser force again to bombard the airfield. And the cruiser force does get through, does bombard, but it doesn't do a lot of damage. It's not like sending battleships in there. And so they think the base is knocked out, but it's not. And once again, the next day, the Japanese are attacked by dauntless dive bombers, TBFs, and everything that we have. And 7 of those 11 transports are destroyed. Well, Yamamoto says, okay, we got to get through. We got to get at least those 4 transports done. We got to get in there. And he's going to send everything he has left, which is the battleship Kirishima, and orders them to go and shell that field with a heavy cruiser force. And he's got 4 transports remaining. And the Japanese admiral in charge of the transports is Tanaka. He's actually quite famous. And they will do everything they can to destroy that airfield and get these ships on land. Well, Halsey makes the decision that I'm going to do everything I can. And what he does is he strips the 2 battleships he has left, which is the Washington and the South Dakota, that are escorting the limping away Enterprise aircraft carrier. And he says, you guys turn around under command of Willis Lee, you go back to Guadalcanal and you stop the Japanese. And this is going to be an amazing fight, in my opinion, because this is one of only 2 times in the Pacific in World War II where a battleship will fight another battleship. I know that probably seems strange. It seems strange to me when you think about pre-war, how important battleships were thought to be. But there's only 2 times in all of World War II where battleships will fight each other. This is one of them. And the Kirishima and its cruisers immediately sink 3 of Lee's destroyers. Then they go ahead and start shelling the South Dakota. And the South Dakota is taking tremendous amounts of hits. It's on the ropes, in effect. But what the Japanese don't realize is the Washington is coming in from a different direction. The Washington sails to within 10,000 yards of the Kirishima, which is point blank range for battleships, and begins to shell it with 16-inch guns, and the Kirishima is quickly sunk, and the Japanese once again retire. What does Tanaka do? He orders those 4 transports to beach, you can see in this picture, on Guadalcanal so they can unload. Unfortunately, once again for the Japanese, we have the airfield, we bomb those transports, we have 2 destroyers go in and shell them, and the Japanese, once again, ability to resupply Guadalcanal is a failure. Well, the Japanese have a name for this place by this time. They're referring to it as Starvation Island. And rat transport is not effective. Again, mostly all they can do is get troops on. They can't get a lot of supplies on. So what's really almost criminal, I'd say here, is that the Japanese continue to bring more and more and more soldiers on this island without proper supplies. Remember, it's a nasty place, okay? It's full of disease. It's rains, it's hot, it's miserable. And people are literally dying from being just there and not being properly fed. Well, the U.S., and I use this in red here, is in the South Pacific as a whole, malaria caused 5 times as many casualties as the Japanese. So you got to understand how bad the Japanese casualties are going to be in this position. So the Japanese are suffering hugely. And finally, in 43, they decide, January of 43, they decide they're going to withdraw. They've had enough. They can't do this anymore. And this is probably the most brilliantly executed thing the Japanese do in the entire battle. Over 3 nights, 20 Japanese destroyers evacuate 10,650 troops. They leave a small rear guard behind and a lot of people that are too sick to travel. The U.S. Army, who's in control at this particular time, doesn't realize that the Japanese have even left and launches an assault into basically an empty island. So 6 months to the day, the Japanese have left this island. So this battle is going on for 6 months at a tremendous pace. And I would ask you to look at this picture. Again, the lower circle there is where Henderson Field is, and it's 22 miles to Tulagi, where Florida Island is. That's how many ships are sunk in this little area. And it gets the name Iron Bottom Sound because of all these losses. It's a incredibly intense battle. Well, the Japanese have lost approximately 30,000 men. Actually, 75% of them have actually died from starvation and disease rather than being killed by us. They've lost about as many ships as we have. They've lost about as many planes as we have. And as we started this presentation, the Japanese cannot afford a battle of attrition. And that's exactly what they've gotten. Well, General Kawaguchi makes this statement: Guadalcanal is no longer merely a name of an island in Japanese military history. It is the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. It's not that they've lost so many men here. There's bigger fighting actually in China. But the fact is they now realize that they cannot stand up to U.S. firepower. So indeed, that is their whole goal, has been the way they've structured their military, is that they could get around that aspect by different tactics, make it simple. They've realized now that that's not the case. And so what happens is Admiral King's great gamble has paid off. Remember, this was Operation Shoestring. He managed to capture this island, to cause a battle of attrition that the Japanese cannot afford, and offensive operations will continue in the Pacific. And everybody knows I don't like counterfactual history. But the fact is, we need to think about the fact, what if the 1st Marine Division had been destroyed at Guadalcanal? It was this close. They certainly had the opportunity to, the Japanese, if things have gone differently, would have destroyed that division. So would that have changed the outcome of World War II? Of course not. The Japanese were going to lose. But the fact is, it would probably have changed the nature of warfare, particularly in 1943. And with that said, next week we will talk about submarines, and thank you all for coming.
My father-in-law, and I spent many hours in a lot of serious stories about the
For now.
and